Welcome to the History of Psychology show. I'm your host, Christopher Green from York University in Toronto, Canada. For this, the sixth episode of the series, I'm pleased to be able to bring to you Nancy Digdon from MacEwan University in Edmonton, Alberta. A few years ago, Nancy and some co-authors were able to make a major discovery in the history of psychology, one which had generated a debate for decades already. They were able to identify Little Albert, or Albert B, from the classic Watson and Rayner Conditioned Emotional Responses article of 1920. That is a study which appears in pretty much every history of psychology textbook and every intro psychology textbook that's ever been written, I suppose. So we're going to talk to Nancy about how they made that discovery, what the aftermath was, a little bit about Nancy's own backstory, and a bit about the history of psychology more generally. I hope you'll stay with us. So Nancy Digdon, welcome to the History of Psychology show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Oh, it's terrific to have you. I'd like to start in the same way I've started a number of the other interviews, talking about teaching, because this has been such a strange year for teaching. You're teaching this semester, I assume?
I am. I'm teaching a section of history of psych at a third year level.
Yeah. And is that online?
It's hybrid, not 100% online.
So explain to me what your version of hybrid is.
Yeah. So I'll back up a little bit. In the fall, it was 100% online, and my university was really trying to up the in-person component. So my version of hybrid is that I will make some optional classes that students can come in to do optional things, but I'm not requiring it. But we have other versions of hybrid where it's actually a required part. Right. So I have 3 in-person days the whole term. Everything else is online.
So you're teaching one course, but it's split over 3 lectures a week. Is that right?
Yeah. It's a Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So yesterday was my first in-person, and I had 4 out of 46 students that were able to come and that it fit, because I really didn't want to pressure it, but some students were really craving some in-person and could do it. I think if we had it in the fall, I probably would have had more. But now, students are sensible. Things like, oh, that sounds neat, I'd like to do it, but I already work with the public and I take transit, and I go, oh yeah, we can do things virtually.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that a lot of lab courses and studio courses in the arts have kept their live component, because they're just, there's certain things you can't do virtually like this.
Yeah, and because we
were and do things with them.
Yeah, because mine is because I did it in the fall 100% online, so it could have before, but I actually was thinking of Michael Sokal for that. I thought, if I have 3 times, what are things I can't do virtually? And so it's all things involving material things. Okay. So yesterday was all of the equipment. I had mics from U of A that from Cheiron, and then we also have some at MacEwan, and so I had them do some of the introspection, the imageless thought, had them do the complication experiment, because we actually had, I don't know why MacEwan has that equipment, but we have it, and you'll look at the quantitative to the qualitative introspecting.
You have Wundt's complication apparatus?
No, I have something. I have a timer, and I have a response panel.
Oh, I see. Like a modern equipment or like old brass?
Modern. Yeah, modern as in it, because we're 1971. So, because that was there when I came in 1990. So I don't know why they have it. We also had something that's kind of interesting. I don't know why in our lab, essences for wine tasting.
Oh yeah.
The odor. So we did that for introspecting. And nice. Students have always liked that for the qualitative part, to get, the vocabulary, and whether it's faint or very bold or duration.
Right. So that's interesting. Most of our listeners probably don't know this, but the only Canadian to have gotten a PhD with Wilhelm Wundt was John McKeen, who was the founder of the philosophy and psychology department at University of Alberta there in Edmonton.
Right. And the chair of the Alberta Eugenics Board.
for many, many years. As I recall, he spent much more time doing that than teaching psychology.
Yeah, because, you know, it's funny you mentioned that from McEachran, because one of the things I brought in, because I had a display at the front and then a bunch of hands-on things for them. And at the front was a cast of the ventricles. And on it said from Würzburg. And I thought, you know, U of A, that's 1903. Where do you think that came from? And then we got into McEachran being a Wundt student.
Yeah.
And probably, you know.
He's a really interesting story, but we will do that some other time.
That's right. Yeah.
So you were all online last term, but this term you're doing the hybrid courses. How large are your courses?
So 46.
Yeah.
They had been 40 until this past fall.
Yeah. And do you like, is there something, almost everybody is unhappy and uncomfortable with online, it seems, except for people who already have a lot of experience in it, like Kathy Fay did. Is this the first time you've taught online?
It is. Yeah.
Is there anything you like about it?
I like the pre-recorded lecture part.
Yeah.
And I really like that for some student, because the way I did it is I pre-recorded lectures and then ran the virtual session where we could talk about it and ask questions. And that has worked well.
So they would watch on their own time the lecture, what was convenient for them, and then you'd use the class time for discussion on that. So it's like sort of like a flipped class.
It is, yeah. And I did, because again, our situation was, I knew some students could have disrupted childcare and different things about being available at set times. Yeah. I have Monday, Wednesday, Friday virtual times, but they are all optional. So Monday is drop-in office hours. Wednesday, I call enrichment to say this, you know, and I would have the agenda, and 3 of those enrichment days are when the in-person is. And then Friday is virtual to actually teach the textbook chapter. Oh, okay. I wasn't planning to do that, but last term I found some students were overwhelmed with reading with all their various courses, and in back and forth email with one student, I'm there, well, you know, I could do that in Collaborate Ultra if you want, you know, some images and things to go with the chapter. She goes, oh yes, please. And she never missed. Last term, there was only a few students came, and now a lot of students come for the Friday one.
Right. So let's talk about Albert B.
Yeah.
So you, for those, let me set this up first. It's going to take a minute here, so that, because I'm not sure where our listeners are with this. So for those of you who might be unaware, the person who is credited with founding the School of Behaviorism in Psychology, John B. Watson, and his then graduate student, later wife, Rosalie Rayner, conducted an experiment on a baby in which they attempted to condition him to fear a white rat that he was not naturally afraid of. They did this by making a loud noise when the rat was presented to the baby by striking a metal bar. And then they saw how far the fear that they had conditioned in the baby generalized to other similar stimuli: a rabbit, a dog, a Santa mask, a fur coat, that sort of thing. And then they speculated whether the baby would grow up with a phobia of furry animals. The baby was called Albert B in the article, although many people refer to him as Little Albert. And there has long been speculation about the identity of Albert B and how he developed emotionally after the experiment. I used to regularly receive emails from students and teachers alike asking me to answer the question of Albert B's fate. And I would often direct them to Ben Harris's 1979 article, Whatever Happened to Little Albert, which doesn't actually answer the question, but rather redirects the reader to the question of why the article became so foundational in psychology in the first place, and how it has been misreported and misinterpreted in the decades since. So the experiment has become increasingly controversial in recent times as the ethical rules guiding psychological research have steadily tightened. Questions like how informed was the consent that Watson received from the mother of the baby? Was it ethical to repeatedly bring a baby to the point of tears by scaring it with a loud noise? That sort of thing. I even once received a message from someone claiming to be a descendant of Watson who wanted contact information for Albert B's descendants so that he could apologize to them for his ancestor having scared their ancestor as a baby. But then in 2009, a team led by Hall Beck dug into the records and claimed to have figured out who Albert B was. They identified a baby named Douglas Merritt, or Merritt, we're not sure which, Merritte, and argued that Watson gave him the pseudonym Albert B because Watson's own middle name, Broadus, came from a minister whom his mother had admired, Albert Broadus, therefore Albert B. But there turned out to be an unexpected wrinkle in the story. Douglas Merritt, the boy they identified as Albert B, was a seriously disabled child. He suffered from hydrocephalus, and he died just a few years after Watson and Rayner's experiment. And this raised all kinds of disturbing ethical questions about whether Watson had knowingly experimented on a disabled child and misreported the child's health in order to make the generalization of his work to other people seem more plausible, etc., etc. But your co-author, Nancy, Russell Powell, was critical of this identification of Albert B with Douglas Merritt right from the start. So could you start by telling us what his early reservations were?
Yeah, Russ's background is behaviorism. He is the lead author on a second-year textbook on behavioral, and so he's read extensively for Watson. And I actually have this one at home. So in his behaviorism book, Russ had noticed that Watson wrote, the experiments discussed in the last chapter were completed in 1920, finding that emotional responses could be built in with great readiness. No further tests could be made upon Albert B, the youngster in which the conditioned responses had been built up, because he was shortly afterwards adopted by an out-of-town family. So Russ was concerned that, that adoption piece. And then Russ is really good for attention to detail and things. He noticed that little Albert, Watson and Rayner had written that he had been brought to the hospital, implying that he wasn't born there. Mm-hmm. And he also then was looking at one of the things that's indeterminate is Watson and Rayner never say the exact dates when the study was run, but they give the age of the baby referred to as Albert B at the time of each session. Mm-hmm. So there was an incident where Watson was writing to the president for funding for film. Now, Watson filmed Albert B, but he filmed other babies too. Mm-hmm. And in it, he's identifying, he's waiting for the temperature to warm. And the time period that they would have started filming was still when it would have been really cold. Like Russ went back to the weather records, mm-hmm. and between December 2nd and December 7th was supposed to be a really cold spell, but the study apparently would have started on December 5th. Right. And also in the very first paper that Beck had, it was very interesting to try to find the baby's mother, mm-hmm. without any apparent hospital records. They had the ingenious idea to realize the capacity to look at census records for 1920. Mm-hmm. And there had been another individual identified named Pearl Barger, mm-hmm. But there was no baby found. And I guess the obvious, the Barger could have had a son named Albert B. Right. So that was kind of what his initial reservations about it.
So then you and Russell and Ben Harris of the University of New Hampshire, who's the fellow who rediscovered, I guess, the little Albert film after it had been lost for decades. And a fellow named Christopher Smithson, who's an independent scholar in the Baltimore area, decided to investigate the available documents on your own. So tell us, if you would, what you did and about the surprising information that you found.
So Russ and I were just talking about looking through, and one day we thought, well, we'll just Google, because we Googled Pearl Barger and Albert, and we got an interesting website that was a private family one for a Charles Martinek. And so these are the descendants of Jacob Martinek of Bohemia and Baltimore. And there was a Charles Martinek who had married a Pearl Barger, and they listed 3 children, a Dorothy, a Dixie, and an Albert. And then in bracket, it was Albert, and in brackets, Bubbles. So here was a Pearl Barger. She was in Baltimore. She was the right age. She could have had a child in that same time period. So we contacted Reverdy Lewin Earl III, was the name on the website, but we never got a reply. And then we didn't really know what to do, but it was intriguing that there was a Pearl Barger in Baltimore who had a son that had Albert as the name. So Russ had a good idea to contact a professional genealogist who is Christopher Smithson in Baltimore. And with that information, I think it was about a week. It was very fast. He first found a marriage certificate and then a birth certificate.
A marriage certificate for Pearl Barger
now this one, because we did have from that Pearl Barger and Charles Martinek,
right?
But I did have a grandmom oral claims Charles went by the name Martin. That not located in any, I don't know what this stands for, BCD, under the name of Charles Martinek.
Right.
So he found once he had the marriage one, then he could look into children.
Right.
From that. So it had to be in that order.
Right.
The birth certificate is interesting, Chris, because he originally was just Baby Barger. And then
wasn't named on the birth certificate.
No, he wasn't named on it. So it is it's a typed form, but the entries are handwritten. So it's Baby Barger, and then at some point there's a line through it, and it's William Albert Martin. Father unknown, line through it, Charles Martin. Father's occupation unknown, line through it, meat cutter.
Right. So we have an Albert Barger, but his actual first name is William, and his last name soon becomes Martin, and so it becomes a little difficult to find him. Is that the?
Yeah, and it's even difficult because then, the birth certificate says March 9th. So then we went to the archives for the Harriet Lane home to see if there was a record.
Right, and the Harriet Lane home is the home that is mentioned in the Watson and Rayner article.
Yes,
where they got Albert B from, right? Yeah,
for that one. So, and I brought home the file because I was in my office yesterday. That because we have a photocopy of it. In the Johns Hopkins Hospital Harriet Lane Home for Invalid Children, his birthday is listed as March 10th instead of March 9th. And his name is Barger, Albert, and with W in brackets.
Right.
That one. And so she comes on April 17th. So in a month, he's got a name. He's now Albert W. And then was admitted. Woman comes in expecting to remain as wet nurse and bring child for examination. The family history of the child has always been well and considered a healthy infant. And then in May 14th, he has an evaluation.
Right. Is that in the medical file, or that's in
this is in the Harriet Lane, the medical one. But I found kind of interesting. So from this one, as an adult, when he's 38, he has a test at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and now he's Charles. he's William A. Martin.
William A.
But the archive has linked the two files together. So they knew it was the same person.
Right. So his father, Charles Martinek, changes his name
to Charles Martin.
Martin to Americanize it, and that's the name that Albert Barger ended up with. So great. Now we have a baby who's actually named Albert B, which makes a whole lot of sense and is pretty strong evidence all in its own right. But you found other evidence that made Albert Barger the more persuasive candidate for being Albert B. Could you tell us about some of that?
Right. So I just matching him up to the details in Watson and Rayner's report. The Harriet Lane home with the March 10th birthday, he fits the schedule. So in his file, Watson and Rayner say that the mother and baby leave on the last day of the study, and they say the age of the baby at that time, and he matches that one perfectly. Looking at the timelines of the study or the schedule. So in Albert Barger's file, it says mother suddenly decided to leave the hospital, patient discharged in excellent condition. And on that day, it does coincide the right age and with when the last day of the study would have occurred. And that there's a couple of things though that don't fit, Chris. But I'll say that. So with that timeline, the last day would have been the end of March, and Watson and Rayner published in the February issue in 1920. I know some journals had been delayed resuming publications after World War I. I don't know if that was the case for the Journal of Experimental Psychology, which Watson also happened to be the editor of. Okay, so that doesn't match up the time. And the other one, to get back to Russ's original concern about the weather, Albert Barger would have done the first part of the study on December 6th, and it didn't start to warm up until December 7th. Okay? And if you notice in the film, the way the baby's dressed in the early session, he doesn't have many clothes on. He's even got an open undershirt. And in the later session, he's bundled up. So it's a little hard to say why, in early December, he's not wearing much clothing, and later a lot more clothing. So I guess
it had to do with how long he'd been inside since he was brought over to the lab and things like that.
Yeah. And that's another one. There's no evidence of him change. There's no direct evidence that says off to the Phipps clinic today, time for another session. But that's not recorded in it. The only time they mention location is when he's moved out because he has measles. And when he moves back, that's the only.
And I want to clarify the earlier point about the timing of the issue. So the issue is dated. The issue in which it was published is dated February.
Correct.
We have reason to believe that he didn't actually leave until late March.
He wouldn't. Yeah. So with both.
The question is, did Watson release the February issue in April or something? Doesn't call it the February issue, which is not all that uncommon. We don't know anything about how the journal was produced, do we?
No. And I mean, we also don't know, we don't have a definitive list of all the wet nurses because of the employment records. Although I don't know, they were assumed not to exist, but the baby's files were assumed not to exist and were later located. So I don't know if that's similar case. If the study had been done earlier in the fall, like late September, it could have ended before January 2nd when they did the census. And in that case, a wet nurse would not be in the record.
Well, for what it's worth, I'm pretty persuaded that Albert Barger makes a better candidate for Albert B than anyone else. Tell us a bit about what happened to Albert Barger, so we can answer the question that everyone always asks me: whatever happened to Albert B?
We've only talked to one family member, his niece, Dorothy Parthry, and she didn't know anything about her uncle having been adopted or that. He said that maybe I'll talk about the dog one
Okay.
for that.
Sure.
So
but Albert Barger continues. I just want he continues to live. He lives a very long life. He dies
into his
in
80s.
90s or something like that.
He worked in
That's not
sales.
that many years before you started doing this research. If you'd done it 10 or 15 years earlier, you might have seen him, yes?
And she thought he would have, if it was the case, he would have been very, very interested. Loved music, loved to read, worked in sales, spent some time in Texas, but most of the time in Maryland.
Really?
Was married, divorced, no children.
Really?
So I think she was very close to him.
Right. So Watson speculates that Albert B is going to have this phobia of dogs and other furry animals, and Albert Barger or Albert Martin, tell us about it.
He didn't like, and she volunteered this, talking about that the family had small barky dogs and they had to lock them away when he would come to visit, and sometimes they would bring it out and it would be a big issue. But she had talked with him about why he didn't like dogs, and the reason he gave was, as a child he had a dog and saw it got hit by a car. And she never quite understood that, and it wasn't so much a fear or dislike. She thought he was very fastidious dresser. He didn't like commotion or confusion, and it might have been more that than fear. But he didn't definitely
really phobia. It was just a
dislike. Like to the point, family members, it would be a joke, but they would put their dogs away. Right. When he came, they'd be locked.
Good behaviorists would say confabulation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I always thought, people often ask this question, and I always, when I read the Watson and Rayner article, I always thought he's kind of joking because he makes a reference to psychoanalysis and Freud, and it struck me as he was just kind of making a snide remark at the end of the article. It wasn't a serious thing. Even if you had conditioned a baby to be fearful of furry animals, presumably that reaction would be extinguished by its later experience of furry animals that were not associated with the clanging of a loud bar and all that sort of stuff.
I had interpreted it similar to you, that he was being facetious, like the Freudians. But he makes that comment that I didn't take it as serious.
That's right. And of course, the final line, the final incident is that Watson's own son, one of Watson's own sons, becomes a psychoanalyst, does he not?
Yes. Yeah.
So there, Dad. All right.
That's right.
All right. So the identification of Albert B is a pretty important discovery in the history of psychology, but you don't, or at least didn't at the time, identify as a historian. You were primarily a sleep researcher. So tell us a bit about your background. You've been in Alberta for a long time, but you didn't start there. Where were you born and raised?
So I was born in Bathurst, New Brunswick, but raised in a place that used to be called Chatham, but now is called Miramichi. It's an amalgamation of several small towns.
And were your parents academically inclined?
No. But valued education.
Yeah.
But my mother had gone to normal school, but wasn't a teacher. And my dad was an entrepreneur and owned a shoe store.
So people who don't remember what normal schools are, that's where you teach teachers to teach, yes?
Right.
And had she worked as a teacher at all, or did she?
She didn't like it. Yeah. And I think I'm the second oldest of 5 children. Mm-hmm. And when my sister was born, she didn't teach.
I see. And so was going to university an obvious thing for you, or was there, a decision made in a story? And
one of the nice things about being one of 5 children is you have a lot of freedom. There was, so it really wasn't one way or the other. Education was valued, but whether I went to university or not was open.
Right.
And I think that was more from school.
So you ended up in University of New Brunswick and Fredericton, and was that your decision, or they didn't obviously didn't push that at all?
No.
And were you attracted to psychology immediately, or did that take a while?
No, it took a while, and I'll back up a little bit because maybe a little bit. In Chatham was about 5,000 or 7,000 people. There was no library, there was no bookstore, so school was books. Mm-hmm. And I think we also had some really good teachers because it really was, even in my day, and I'm 62, some of the families in the area, if there were sons and daughters, even someone my age, it would be assumed that the sons would go to university, but it didn't really matter what
Right.
the daughters did. And
because it was assumed they would marry and
yeah,
Yeah.
that. So I started out in elementary education in special ed. And I think I switched going into my second year.
Mhm.
I really liked the practice teaching. I really disliked the courses. And psychology was one of the courses that I liked better.
Mhm.
And I also think in the psychology department at University of New Brunswick, they do a really good job of mentoring students. So as undergrads, you get to go into labs and do things. You get to TA courses. I think at that time they might have had master's students. I don't think they had PhD, but I might be wrong on that. So I liked psychology better, but I also took other courses too. When I was in elementary education, I was taking advanced calculus as my electives, which was really quite, and then going back to elementary education and looking at long division and ways to do it. And I thought I'm not in the right place. And then I took some forestry courses. I took German just because I was curious, because I was exposed to French and English, but I'd never heard German. So that I never took any history, but I would have loved history. But I just, you don't.
It sounds like the perfect way to do university education. Everybody sort of wants to come in knowing what they want and what job they're going to get, on day one. And you just often, when you come out of high school, you just don't really know what's available. You know the 12 things they teach in high school, but not the 100 and other things they teach in university. And you have to sort of dabble around to figure out what you like and what you're good at.
Yeah. And I think I ultimately chose, I think it was the mentorship in that department. And plus I was interested and it fit with my interest in special education. But I think it was the mentorship within that department.
Right. So you graduate with a degree in psychology. And then you fly halfway across the country to, or maybe drive, I don't know.
Train, actually.
To University of Western, what was then called University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario. What brought that on?
So that I had applied a few places. I'm not quite sure why I chose Western. I'd also applied Minnesota was one for child study, U of T and UBC. And I think this might, having grown up in Chatham, when I first came to Fredericton, I thought it was a city. And then so I think size of place mattered. For that.
I should say for our audience, U of T is University of Toronto and UBC is University of British Columbia.
Because all of the research areas were interesting. So I think it was on the size of the city and living there.
So you weren't looking for a specific topic and picking out a supervisor for that topic at this point. You just you went to a place that seemed right for you.
And I mean, I was interested in lots of different things. There wasn't one particular.
So you did a master's there, and then you became a student of Alan Paivio for your PhD. And Alan Paivio was a pretty big deal in the 1980s in cognitive science and in like the theory of mental representation. I remember him. Here's a story you probably don't know about me. I was actually accepted just a couple of years later by Alan Paivio's arch rival, Zenon Polishin, who was also at University of Western Ontario at the time. But I ended up going to University of Toronto instead. So we could have brushed early on.
That's right.
But so what was it like working with Paivio? He was a big deal.
He was great. I really, really liked him. I started out in my master's. It was, I would say some models of supervision are more like RA. So a person has a well-developed research program and they slot students to each piece. There was a lot of I would call fast academia. So I did my master's in a year, wrote up one paper off the bat, shooting out, but the master's wasn't really my idea to begin with. That,
You were
and I
filling
remember
out what the lab was working on or something?
yeah. And you get your piece and you do it up. And
Right.
I mean, that's really good training on some things. And I remember talking with my supervisor, who was like, just had a really fast, big science kind of model about, I did all my coursework. I did some applied stuff. I did 2 research projects in the year and finished, and that I wanted to slow down a bit. And he goes, well, tell me about your day, your time. And so I say all things, in the TA, all that things. He goes, I don't see what you're talking about. What are you doing between 4 and 6 in the morning? And I thought,
oh, well,
okay, like this is kind of and I had taken psychology of language with, I still call him Dr. Paivio. That. And I really liked that course, and I talked to him about, because I was interested in more theory component to it. So I did my dissertation stuff wasn't related to his, but there was enough cognitive overlap that worked really, really well.
Right.
But he was a super supportive advisor.
So what was your dissertation research?
So it still had a developmental thing. It was on, I was influenced by Johnson Laird's and mental model, so that there was some imagery connection to that. So it was cognitive.
Yeah. So you finish your PhD, you do a few years as a sessional here at York, and then you go out to University of Alberta, but you eventually land at what our American listeners will call a community college. Is that what they called them in Alberta? Was it called a community college?
Yes. Yeah.
2-year college in Edmonton, same as University of Alberta, called MacEwan. So what was MacEwan like when you first got there in the early 90s?
Oh, I loved it.
Yeah.
Well, I'll back it up a little bit. Yeah. I had my daughter about a month before I defended my PhD. So that changed trajectory. And we were Mike had a job at York for 1 year, so I taught part-time. In fact, they were short someone to teach when we arrived, and then we landed in Alberta. And then I had a second child, and I meanwhile had gone the registration route and had worked 1 year at the cancer hospital, loved it. And then MacEwan, and I also think I taught maybe one course at U of A part-time. And when the MacEwan job opened up, my youngest was a year old. And it intrigued me because the teaching thing, the population thing, and I really, really liked it. So when I started in 1990, we were 2 years into developing university transfer. Prior to that, they were diploma programs and certificate programs. But I really liked it. I liked the student populations, and I liked the variety and the focus on the teaching.
Yeah. And so how did sleep become your research area?
Okay, so I make a lot of pragmatic decisions, I think. So the sleep one came when we expanded from community college university transfer to offering the full degree. And so then, is that around 2008?
Okay.
Around there. And we needed to develop opportunities for students to do research. And I took a sabbatical year and developed the sleep one, because I thought that's something that students are interested in, I'm interested in, and we could do little projects on it. And plus I have sleep disorder, so that was kind of the interest. I thought that might be something to do. But yeah, so that was chosen because basically we were faced with opportunities for students to engage in research that don't require infrastructure.
Right.
And then I found doing that for a bit, it was a lot of effort and doing the work, and I was losing interest in it because I would get ideas but not have the infrastructure,
Right.
and always choosing things that were appropriate for a third or fourth year students, or take their ideas and yeah.
You have this really interesting career where you spent the first 18 years in a community college, although it was one that was preparing students to transfer to university after they'd finished there. But then the last, whatever it's been, 13 years of your career has been at a full 4-year university.
Yeah.
And how large is MacEwan now?
Yeah. So they say 19,000 students. I think that's the head count, but not the full load equivalent. It might be 12,000, something like that.
Right. Oh, so it's 19,000 full-time equivalents, but not actually full-time actual.
Yeah. Like,
that's a pretty big university.
Yeah, no, we really grew. Yeah. And we're the biggest, what they call in Alberta, transfer in, because we have mobility across institutions. And of course, before we were only transfer out, where students would do 2 years with us and finish their degree at University of Alberta.
So people who
now
people who go to community college, other community colleges now tend to transfer to MacEwan.
The University of Alberta transfers to us.
Yeah.
Now it goes the other way.
That's interesting. That's really. You must be, people there must be very proud about that. Because I have to say, I mean, I should tell this story. When I met you, and you said you were from MacEwan University, and I thought I understood the university system in Canada pretty well. I had never heard of MacEwan University, and I was quite so. For people who don't know, there's a lot of universities in Canada that are religious colleges or formerly religious colleges that are associated with one of the major universities. And so my guess was that you were the, I don't know, Presbyterian college associated with University of Alberta or something like that. But the story was entirely different.
Yeah.
And you created this, you and your colleagues have created this large university in one of the biggest cities in the country over the last 40 years. It's quite impressive, or 30 years, I guess, quite impressive. As I mentioned before, you were, as we've talked about, you were mostly a sleep researcher prior to your work on Albert B. What drew you to history? Were you teaching history of psychology before that, or?
Well, I think when you're a full-time community college teaching, you can't help but get drawn into history. Because when you're teaching the array, what I would call read around the edges. I would always be drawn to history to try to give more context and things. And then I did have a chance to teach the course I'm teaching now, the third year history of psych. Another colleague had started it and then didn't want to pursue it, so I really gravitated that. I didn't really know what history was. Right.
And so did Russell draw you into this project, or was this, how did you?
For the little Albert? Yeah. No, because I had by that time been teaching history of psych for 4 or 5 years.
Right.
And that's so.
And was the little Albert project the first time you'd done sort of primary historical research of that sort?
Correct. Yeah.
So the first time I met you, as I said, I think was at a meeting of Cheiron, which is the International Society for the History of Behavioral and Social Sciences. And was your little Albert, I think it was in the early 2010s, was your little Albert work out at that point? I can't remember.
No, and actually, I'm really grateful to Ben Harris, because we had contacted him. I guess I knew abstractly about Cheiron, but I never thought about going to it, and he was the one that strongly suggested that we go to Cheiron. And so that was really, really good advice. And then it's funny because Russ goes, I'll go to the archive. You go to Cheiron because you really, really like history and you're teaching history. So that was the decision. So we weren't really even thinking about publishing at that point. And we were wanting to present it. And then at Cheiron meeting, Wade Pickren had suggested that we submit there. And then I think it was through Ben, someone contacted from American Psychologist to maybe submit there. And it was kind of to give different versions of papers for the same readerships of the two journals.
Right. So when you're suddenly thrust into this this cadre of dozens and dozens of historians of psychology. What was your impression?
Oh, I really liked it, except I think I had known something, but I didn't realize it.
Yeah.
I knew in philosophy people read papers, but I didn't really know that in history. And I was saying, oh, darn, I wish I would have known that, because preparing for it, I thought it was more like psychology where you couldn't read your paper.
Right.
And then I saw you could.
Well, you sort of drive your talk forward with your PowerPoint slides or something.
Yeah, to see that. I really, really liked it. And I really, really liked all of the various disciplines coming together. Right. And I think that's also from the community college background, because we have a lot of collaborative relationships too. So,
right. Yeah. So, you and Russell have both continued to write about the Albert B problem over the last decade or so. I think you had an article published in the journal History of Psychology just last year on this matter. It may have been available online earlier, 2017 or something, but I think it's officially got a 2020 date. Do you have aspirations to do other sort of historical research, or do you have other projects that are already ongoing?
Two that I've started. That my original one actually goes back to maybe the second year I was teaching history of psych. Of course, when you're not in an area, you're frantically finding things that you will need to get yourself ready to teach that. And I had found a book by Joseph Haven just in a used bookstore here on mental philosophy. And so I thought, oh, that would be good to read. And what really struck me about him is that he clearly talks about a natural science. And he clearly envisions that there will be specialized equipment to do this. And he talks about Wheatstone's stereoscope. Right. But he also combines that with a natural science with human agency. And so that I was really, really interested in that, and still am, and I'm working on that. What was that?
When's that textbook written?
1857 was his first one.
Right.
That, I think the copy I have is 1874.
Right.
And then, he had a separate book on moral philosophy. It's really interesting. And then he goes back into theology. Right. Then he takes a year off and travels through Egypt and Palestine and comes back to the old University of Chicago and to teach mental philosophy again, not using his textbook, but Whalen's.
So to fill people in here, the old University of Chicago the original University of Chicago was this Baptist school in Chicago. There were many small colleges, mostly denominational in the Chicago area, which was not uncommon in US cities at the time. And it collapsed, I don't remember the exact year, in the 1880s sometime. And another college in the Chicago area, Lake Forest College, which was Presbyterian, started making noises about adopting the name University of Chicago after the old University of Chicago had collapsed. So immediately letters were sent out to John D. Rockefeller, who in addition to being the richest man in America was also a staunch Baptist, asking him to please desperately fund a new university called the University of Chicago so that the Baptists could keep that august name. And he did that. And basically the new University of Chicago was run out of Rockefeller's pocket for the first 10 years of its existence or something like that.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. So Haven was Congregationalist. Would that make sense for him to be at the old one?
I wonder, the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians get along. I would have to go look this stuff up. I am not in how these things work. And you said you had a couple of projects. Do you have something else?
Oh, I'll tell you something different about Haven that interested me, as he goes to great length about about evolution with that, but he ties it into slavery.
Oh, really?
About the connection that the humans were distinct, but also keeping theology out of the psychology and establishing that first. So you have sentiments, but not moral sentiments, because of the psychology would be the science first.
Oh, that's interesting. So that early, in the 1850s.
Yeah, 1857. But he didn't stay on. So he wouldn't have any proteges, because he wrote the book and then shortly after left for first the divinity school in Chicago and then comes back for the old University of Chicago.
Right.
So he's got but I was just quite intrigued by his natural science with human agency.
Right. I wonder if it would be interesting to see the different editions, because 1857 is 2 years before the publication of Origin of Species.
Yeah.
But there are other evolutionary theories before that. So is he?
And he cites Spencer. Yeah.
Oh, he mentioned Spencer, right?
Yeah. And he's got quite an extensive bibliography and that. But he has two supplementary parts. One is for the animal and one is for the nervous system.
Right.
But he includes them.
Mm-hmm. These are really interesting books that get dropped out of the sort of standard history of psychology because we're so focused on the laboratory and focused on Wundt. And there were a wide array for a century before Wundt. There's a wide array of books on textbooks on mental philosophy, which were how people learned what we now call psychology, sometimes called mental philosophy, sometimes called mental science, occasionally psychology, although that's a word that doesn't make it into the English language very commonly until the 19th century. It's a German and French word before that.
Because the title of the book is Mental Philosophy, but he refers to the science as psychology.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And you said you had a couple of projects?
Yeah, well, the other one was following up introductory psychology textbooks. And originally I was doing a project with a colleague in sociology and one in anthropology. We were interested in Canadian multiculturalism and some of the political acts and how that multiculturalism gets conveyed at the intro level in textbooks. And that we've done mostly, but that opened up the whole race IQ stuff in psychology. So looking from 1990 going to the present, there's been some interesting and maybe disturbing developments in how that is portrayed in intro books. Mm-hmm. And that project we were going to finish this year, but we wanted to collect some student data and some data from people that teach intro psych. Mm-hmm. And we didn't do that because the person that controls our server and things was furloughed. As I mentioned, Alberta was going through budget cuts simultaneous with the shutdown. So I thought it's not a good time to collect data. And one of the students involved is doing an honors project anyway. He's going to be too busy. The other students already graduated. So we could do this next year.
Right. So are you using textbooks that are originally Canadian, or are you using these Canadian editions of American textbooks?
Both. I don't know of any, Chris, maybe you do, that were originally Canadian.
I haven't taught intro psych ever. And the only intro psych textbook I know that was Canadian was Donald Hebb's, which is the one I used at McGill in many years ago, 1981 or something like that. That was the third edition of his book, which I think it started in the late 50s. Yeah. But I don't know. Bandura wrote an intro psych textbook, I think, and he is originally Canadian but has been at Stanford for,
because he's from Mundare, Alberta, very close to Edmonton.
That's right, he is. And I think he taught at UBC for a couple of years before he got the Stanford appointment. Again, back in the 60s.
Yeah, because we started ours at 1990 because we were following the
I don't know, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, I don't know of any. And that. Yeah. I'll have to tell you about my next in-person teaching one. I'm bringing in different textbooks. I told them I had some from 1890 with the James stuff, all the way through, and asked them, if they had a preference, what ones to bring in. And a student goes, I'd love to see 2000, the year I was born. I wasn't even thinking something that, but I can do that. I have one of those.
Yeah, a few years ago, I made the sad discovery that I had actually been teaching psychology for longer than my students had been alive, and that was
No, I hadn't taught intro for a long time because that was part of our transition towards university. Right. We got pulled out into higher level courses. Right. But I loved intro.
Yeah.
back in the
Yeah,
day.
and the way we
Yeah.
present the discipline to students who don't know anything
Yeah.
about it is really important. So that's
Yeah. Yeah. And Alberta had another wrinkle too. At U of A, psychology split across 3 faculties:
Oh, really?
arts, science, and anything remotely applied or counseling in education.
So
But the art science one was new to me.
So are they different departments, or is it one department just spread across the different faculties?
Arts and science, it's one
Yeah.
department. The counseling child clinical is in a different department altogether.
Oh, really? That's so they have 2 separate psychology. They've split the research
Yes.
and the applied into 2 separate departments, which
Yeah.
people have talked about for many years.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I haven't heard of it actually being done that way.
Yeah. And because that was sort of strange too, because students start to think, well, how do you decide which psychology courses are arts or science?
Yeah.
And there it seems to be anything that has a biological level to it, reduction. So social psych, developmental, those ones are all arts. Perception, brain and behavior are science.
Right. So students only do one or the other. So if you're doing social psychology, you don't learn any brain and behavior?
The opposite one, because at first because we were transferring to we followed their model. We first created the arts degree, and in arts, we really didn't care what psychology courses people took but arts cares a lot. Mm-hmm. And so that distinction, they would actually limit the number of arts psychology courses that a student could take toward their science psych major. So that part was, and it was actually really confusing for students, because students, some of them want to do a science degree, but they want to go into clinical, but clinical psych, a lot of courses they wanted to take were arts degrees, and the science degree would only let them take this number.
See, everybody thinks that these decisions are made on important intellectual bases, and they're not. They're sort of these weird administrative things that don't have anything to do with
then we got around it. We just cross-listed all our courses as both arts and science.
Right.
So then they could, but we still have it that, and I mean, you see it when you teach history comes in, and there's a lot of scientism and a lot of positivism, and those seem to be the basis of some of these decisions too.
Yeah, it's true.
Well,
that seems like a good place to wrap it up. Thank you very much for taking this time with us.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And I hope the lockdown ends soon.
We all do.
Get out. Yeah.
All right. Take care. So that's all for this episode of the History of Psychology show. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to thank Dr. Nancy Digdon for having spent some time with us. You can always leave comments in the YouTube channel. We love to hear what you have to say about the show. Also, for each episode, we supply show notes, which you can get with the YouTube video. It has a chronology of every interview, so you can go back and find sections of the discussion that you'd like to watch again or share with your classes. It has full citations of the various articles that are mentioned or alluded to in the interview, or other sources as well, and occasionally we put in a correction as well. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you'll come back in 2 weeks to watch the next episode of the History of Psychology show.